native-born country of Sweden. I had him on last week for the first time. We ran out of time, but he has a lot to say that's relevant to July 4th. Let me bring on investor and writer Anton Wahlman. He's in Las Vegas, traveling all the time, and originally from, I think, Stockholm, Sweden. Happy July 4th, Anton.
Good to be here, Adam.
All right. What are your thoughts on this holiday that too many Americans take for granted, I think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the bigger picture here is that things that were substantially inconceivable as little as a quarter century ago now seem like they are in question. And that has to do with just the basic tenets of what Americans celebrate and what Americans value. We'd never questioned these things even in the early 1990s, and I would argue that dramatic changes have occurred just in the last 5 to 10 years. And we can speculate as to whose fault that was. Of course, we had a recent president who was no help in celebrating anything American, and I think the bigger backdrop to that in turn has been the long-term indoctrination in the U.S. school system over the better part of 50 to 60 years, and the attendant reinforcement of all of those things by essentially the Hollywood/television culture.
All the investment in indoctrinating kids as early as kindergarten, maybe even earlier, is starting to pay off as they're adults now, I suppose.
That's right. And I mean, all of these concepts that, I mean, I'm seeing it in the intersection between politics and investment also. We see it in the case of people believing that all of these solutions to real or alleged climate change and its causes is something that drives not just political decisions, but even investment decisions now, and that it's almost taken for granted in some quarters that enormous government expenditures should be made in order to chase essentially phantom phenomena, such as potentially the fact that over time maybe there are minuscule changes to the weather, or maybe there aren't.
Right. And hey, look, we're out of northeast central Florida here, and we had a drought until maybe 3-4 weeks ago, and people talked about it, and now it's overcompensated the other day. We're getting way more rain than is typical here, and that is just nature. I mean, you could have made a talk about, people could have talked about climate change just a few weeks ago. Now, no, things have a tendency to restore, regression to the mean, I suppose is the term. Yeah, I hear you. And it's weird. I got to bring something else up. You talk about in terms of the business world. I mean, it's just weird being on Twitter and seeing an advertisement for something like Fifth Third Bank, and who cares what they said? The thing I noticed is their logo in a rainbow form, and it's just, what? Are the marketing departments totally taken over? Is anyone afraid to say anything? What does that have to do with celebrating homosexuality? I mean, I don't know if you want to go there, but I have to point that out right there. I mean,
I've noticed the same things, and I, of course, watch more so than anything the automotive industry, and I see it in a lot of ads. We saw it on the Super Bowl last February, for example, where many of the automakers come. I mean, these are covert socio-political messages that are being spread, where all sorts of criticisms of basic norms of American culture are being spread in the advertising departments by very large Fortune 500 corporations. And I think it's, first of all, it's disgusting on the face of it. Secondly, as we pointed out, it does change people's attitudes to these things. I mean, eventually we can argue that over long periods of time, these things will face a backlash, and, it took 75 years or whatever until the Soviet Union fell apart. But you know what? I don't want to live 75 years until there's a backlash to these things. I'd rather not, see bad things happen in the first place. I mean, we can all say that after Auschwitz, people got a greater awareness of genocide. Well, I have a better proposition for you. Let's not have the genocide in the first place, okay? Yep. So I'd rather not see American and general basic Western civilization and culture destroyed in the first place, only to be able to have future generations write history books 200 years from now as to how it was wholly or partially recovered from the abyss. So I don't look at these things as positive developments at all, even though in the long term we can hope or pray that they lose out. I think these are terrible things.
Yep. Yeah, I'm curious. I live in a fairly conservative area, at least for now. I'm in, near Daytona Beach, Florida, and July 4th means a parade and going to the beach and fireworks there. When you're this close to the beach, frankly, that takes precedence over anything else on a July 4th weekend. Understandable. And that's probably true for any shore town this time of year. But in areas where people don't go away, you were in Silicon Valley for a long time, Las Vegas. Have you seen any change in the way people observe the 4th of July? Is it like kind of hopelessly square? Is it kind of dated? Or do you think the same spirit is still there?
Well, I mean, first of all, there are a lot of ships passing in the night, but at the same time, the trends are clear. I mean, to the extent these things are celebrated at all, it's now more of a sort of strictly a barbecue, and then the stage that comes after transforming these things into a strict barbecue is to then sprinkle them with all of these sort of social leftist messages, be it the example that we both mentioned in terms of large corporate advertising or something else. But I mean, it's going from something that has at least a tad of history and patriotism around them to purely entertainment and partying and a day off from work. And then the next step after that is basically we're in the Khmer Rouge indoctrination stage. So it's going from, obviously what we knew back in the, several decades past to something that is perhaps somewhat innocent and somewhat neutral to something that is outright terrible. So these are again, horrible trends on all accounts.
We have a couple minutes left. I would like to get your perspective in terms of 4th of July, whether it's, whether people are really reading about it or looking at it that substantively. People still observe the 4th of July. There's still American flags. People may be wearing them as their clothes, fireworks, etc. But what about Sweden? You caught my attention like a week or two ago when you posted something about a midsummer celebration that was traditional in Sweden 40 years ago that you say don't really exist anymore. Is there even anything like the 4th of July going on in Sweden today? What's your unique personal perspective
there are a lot of similarities in terms of what I think has transpired over the last 10 or 20 years in particular, in which essential displays of some form of cultural heritage. Some will call them nationalism. Well, I mean, nationalism has a bad wording to it a little bit. It's like people associated with other things that have nothing to do with Independence Day celebrations or anything of the kind, but rather these are symbols of some sort of cultural heritage more than anything else. And I think that that aspect of these things have a great deal of similarity in terms of how they've developed, especially in the last decade or two. Or, obviously these things have very different histories going back, many, many decades past, let alone centuries. But yeah, I think that as the population has diversified away from being what it used to be and from people's, not just memory, but people's basic education about what these things represent are dwindling away, I think that other things come into their stead. I mean, I think that we have all of these new types of quote-unquote celebrations of all of these cultural phenomena in the last decade or two that are encroaching upon these things, and they tend to basically diminish the national culture, and I think they give way for basically accepting higher degrees of immigration from places where people are not supportive of any of these things, and therefore, I do see some similarities here between the loss in the patriotic spirit and the sense of history around Independence Day in the United States to the way that people celebrate the equivalent day in a country such as Sweden.
One other thing, July 4th, of course, led to the Revolutionary War, and you had to have a certain confidence among the males. It was males in the population who were armed and we're able to say to British, F you, to the British, F you, basically. We're going to form our own country. You come here to try to do something about it. Can you compare that to the mentality, like in the, I hate to say it, like the neutered Sweden and Western Europe of today?
No, I think that there's a lot to be said for that, and I think the situation in Europe in general is a lot worse than it is here, especially in Western Europe. Maybe a little bit as opposed to Eastern Europe right now, but nevertheless. But we had a situation where we had an enormous psychological drawback in Western Europe following World War II, which
Sweden was neutral in, of course. So
Sweden was neutral in it, and not every country was exactly the same. I mean, the UK, I would argue, has been on clearly a different level than, say, Germany or Holland or Belgium, of course, and of course France had a particular situation with their colonies and the legionnaires and so forth. So the countries do differ a little bit from each other. But I think that what we've seen in terms of the cultural shift over the last 2 generations to almost 3 generations now in Europe is in this, as you call it, these things being neutered a little bit in terms of how the new generation feels about these things. In Europe, of course, personal handgun ownership and so forth is in general a lot lower than it is in the United States. And I think that these countries in Western Europe today have a really poor ability to defend themselves in a multitude of levels. I mean, I think at least in the U.S., we've had a stratification of society in that the people that grew up in a handful of small coastal cities, or not so small, but small geographic areas. I mean, if you're growing up in the middle of San Francisco or in the middle of New York City right now, maybe even in the middle of Los Angeles, you might as well be living in a European city. Right. However, if you live almost anywhere else in the United States today, at least on that front, there's still a significant contingent who could, I would hate to say it, take up arms, but in terms of living through a situation that would be at least somewhat analogous to what we saw during the Revolutionary War, and something that we might conceive of in the future. You remember the movie Red Dawn from 1984, where, the Soviets invade and, the teenagers and whatever, they head up to the mountains in their pickup trucks and they mount a defense, and kind of the movie is a little, unclear about what ultimately happens. But I think the spirit of being able to do something like that, there's still something of that left here. And I think that is substantially, I mean, you can pretty much write that off anywhere in Europe right now. So I think they've taken that extra step, and I think that came a little bit from the aftermath of World War II and how that stayed on, and the fact that they had this culture over there of things. I mean, they were basically victims, right? They viewed themselves as huge victims of what happened in World War II. They had a lot of shame, whereas the U.S. came out of World War II with a sense of being the victor. There was a lot of pride, and then of course some things happened, first in Korea and then in Vietnam to essentially put doubts in these things. But I think a lot more of this still remains in the U.S. than it does in Europe, and we'll see how long that will last. But I think for now, it's looking okay.
All right. So thanks for your great perspective there on July 4th. People, if they want to follow you, let me make sure I have this right. It's just Anton Wahlman, Anton Wahlman on Twitter or Facebook. You should be easy to find. And your articles, which are mostly about the automotive industry, can be found at seekingalpha.com. They just look for you under author. Anything else I should have included there?
I think that's absolutely correct. That's about it.
All right. Happy July 4th.